ocean with you right now. If you want more videos like